Nobody in Coldwater ever wrote down what they did that summer. They wrote down the rainfall, none. They wrote down the cattle prices falling. They wrote down who owed the bank and how much, and they wrote the widow's name wrong on purpose every time in the ledger at the mercantile, because it amused them. I know because I kept a ledger too, 54 years old, and I'd never once let a debt go unrecorded. Owed, owing, 2 columns, and everything in the world fit into one of them. Then a young rancher named Tobias Meacham stood up in front of the whole town and married a blind Apache widow, and I watched grown men laugh at a woman who couldn't see them doing it. I didn't laugh. I want that in the record. But I didn't say anything either, and God help me, that's the same thing wearing a cleaner shirt. What happened after, the water, the fire, the boy, the thing she did in the dark that not one of us could have done in daylight, I have written it out 3 times and burned it twice. This is the 3rd time, this one I'm keeping. Some debts you can't put in a column. The boy led her to the wrong man on purpose. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the laughing. Laughing is cheap. Laughing is what a crowd does when it doesn't know what its own face is doing. But the boy, 9 or 10 years old, draper's nephew, freckled like a trout's belly, and he took her by the elbow so gentle you'd have thought he was raised right, and he walked her 12 steps past Toby Meacham and set her hand down on a fence post. She said, "Tobias." To a fence post, gray cedar, weathered soft, with a horseshoe nail sticking out of it about the height of a wedding ring. And Coldwater laughed. I had my ledger in my breast pocket. I always did. Small brown thing, string binding, and inside it 2 columns in my own cramped hand, owed on the left, owing on the right, every head of cattle, every sack of feed, every favor and grudge, an $8 debt from here to the Gila. My wife used to say I'd write down a sunset if I could figure out who to bill for it. She's been dead 9 years. I wrote that down too. There's a page with just the date on it and nothing else, because I could not for the life of me decide which column she went in. I'm telling you this so you understand what kind of man was standing there doing nothing. Toby crossed the ground fast. Not running, Toby never ran. He had that long-legged rancher's walk that eats distance without seeming to hurry but fast. He came up beside her and he didn't touch her. That's what I noticed. Every man in that churchyard would have grabbed her arm, turned her around, steered her like a wheelbarrow. Toby stopped an arm's length off and he said, low, just her name. Not Nahzhee, the way the town said it, with the sneer built into it like a nail in a board. He said it the other way. The right way. 3 sounds where we heard 2, and the middle one soft, the way you'd say a word you didn't want to wake anybody with. She turned toward his voice. Her hand came off the fence post slow, like she was setting down something she'd decided not to buy. And I watched her face, and there wasn't one thing on it. Not embarrassment, not anger, nothing. It was the face of a woman who had heard laughter before, from men holding worse things than hymnals, and had already learned exactly how much of herself to give it. Which was none. I am here, she said. Her English was careful. Every word set down like a stone in a creek crossing, tested before she put weight on it. I know, Toby said. I'm sorry, I should have come to you. You should not have to. And Reverend Sill cleared his throat and got on with it, and the ceremony took 4 minutes, and when it was over about half of Coldwater walked away without a word. The other half stayed to eat the food, because there was food. I stayed. I ate a piece of dried apple pie standing up, and it tasted like ashes and cinnamon, and I have never in my life felt so much like a coward with a full mouth. Now some accounting. Tobias Meacham was 27 that summer. His father, Eugene Meacham, had pulled me out of the Cimarron in 1871 when I was drunk enough to drown in 18 inches of water, and he never once mentioned it again. And he died of a bad heart in his own hayfield in March of '85 while his sons were 2 miles off branding. That's an entry in my ledger. Owed, left column, never paid, never can be, and the man's under sod. So when Toby's mother followed her husband inside a year, folks said grief. I say it was the winter and the water and the fact that she'd stopped eating the way a person stops paying a bill they don't intend to honor. Toby was left with 460 acres of hard grass, 100-odd head of scrub cattle, a mortgage held by the Coldwater stock and savings, and Ezra Meacham, 9 years old, Toby's brother, born late and small, the kind of child who talks to horses and not to people. He had a stutter that came and went with his nerves and a habit of carrying a dead man's pocket knife everywhere. Their father's bone handle, one blade snapped short. He'd take it out and turn it over and over in his hands while other folks talked. Never opened it, just turned it. Everything Toby loved fit in one sentence. The boy, the horses, and 460 acres of ground his father had bled into. Everything Coldwater wanted also fit in one sentence, and it was almost the same sentence. Cass Draper owned the mercantile, the freight contract, a piece of the bank. And this is important, the only good year-round water on the north side of the valley. A spring-fed tank he'd fenced with cedar and topped with wire in '83 while everybody was looking somewhere else. Draper was not a villain. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and it would be a lie. He was a broad, pleasant, unhurried man who wore a linen duster in a country with no linen and called everybody by their first name and remembered their children's ages. He'd loaned money to half the valley on a handshake. He'd buried 2 wives. When my Sarah was dying, he sent a girl out with soup for 11 days straight and never sent a bill, and I checked, I looked for it. I wanted there to be a bill. He also wanted the Meacham place, and he wanted it the way water wants downhill, patiently, without malice, and without ever once stopping. And he had a daughter, Delia Draper, 24, sharp as a boot nail and twice as useful, who had been walking out with Toby Meacham for 2 years before his father died and for 8 months after. Now I don't know what happened between those two. I'm a rancher, not a novelist. What I know is that in September of '86 Delia stopped coming out to the Meacham place, and in October Draper offered Toby $11 an acre for ground worth 18. And in November the note on the Meacham mortgage came up for renewal and the interest went from 6 to 9. And when Toby asked why, the bank clerk said, "Conditions," and looked at the wall. Toby didn't sell. That was the first thing that made the town uneasy about him. He didn't argue, didn't bluster, didn't take it to the paper. He just didn't sell. There's a particular kind of stubbornness that isn't loud at all, and it makes people crazy because there's nothing to push back against. It's like leaning on a mountain. I put it in my ledger under owing, meaning, this boy is going to need something and I'm going to owe it to him, and I don't yet know what it is. She came in April. Toby had gone down to Fort Bayard for hinges, and come back with a woman walking behind his horse. That's how the story went around Coldwater by supper the next day, and like most stories that go around by supper, it had the facts arranged in the ugliest possible order. What actually happened? I got this from Toby a long while later in a barn at 2 in the morning, when neither of us was in a condition to lie, is that he found her on the road 9 miles out, walking east, alone, with a sack and a stick. She'd been at San Carlos, then she'd been at Bowie. Then, when the trains went east in '86 with the last of Geronimo's people packed in them like cordwood, somebody had looked at a blind woman with no husband and no children and no obvious use, and decided she wasn't worth the ticket. So she'd been left, not released. There's a difference, and the difference is that nobody wrote her name down anywhere. She was not on a list. She was not anyone's responsibility. She had been set aside the way you set aside a broken hame strap, meaning to deal with it later, meaning nothing at all. She had been walking for 11 days. Toby said the thing that stopped him wasn't that she was blind. It was that she was walking east, into the sun, on a road with no shade at a pace. She had a direction. She'd made a decision about where the world was and she was going there. He asked where she was headed. She said, away from that. And she pointed back over her shoulder west, without turning her head, and she had the direction exactly right. He hired her. I want to be plain about this because the town never was. He hired her at wages, $4 a month and board, and she slept in the tack room and she worked. And before you ask what work a blind woman does on a cattle outfit, let me tell you what I saw with my own 2 eyes in May, when I rode over about a horse. The Meacham place had a windmill that had been screaming for 3 years. Everybody knew it. You could hear it from the road, a shriek on the downstroke like a hurt cat. Eugene had oiled it, Toby had oiled it. I'd climbed up there myself once with a can of tallow and accomplished nothing but a sunburn. I rode up that morning, and the yard was quiet. She was standing under the tower with her head tipped back and her hands loose at her sides. Ezra was up on the platform, 20 feet in the air, skinny legs hooked around a strut. "Now," she said. The boy did something with a wrench. Again. He did it again. There, she hadn't moved. That one. The bearing on the she made a shape with her hand, a circle inside a circle because she didn't have the English word and didn't need it, that one. It is dry and it is also crooked. Loosen it first, then oil, not the other way. Ezra loosened it first, then oiled. The wind came around off the mesa, and the wheel turned and there was no scream. Just the flap and creak of a windmill doing its job, the sweetest sound in a dry country, and Ezra up there grinning like a fool with grease to his elbows. I sat my horse, and I didn't say anything for a while. She turned toward me. She'd known I was there since I came around the corral. I found out later. A horse's footfall on packed dirt versus loose. She could tell you the difference at 40 yards. "You are Kettle," she said. "Amos." "Amos Kettle." She said my whole name, both parts, and it sat strangely in my chest, the way it does when someone treats your name like a thing that matters. The one who writes. I had not known that anybody knew about the ledger. I felt about 11 years old. How'd you? The boy talks to the horses. A flicker at the corner of her mouth gone before it settled. Horses talk to no one, but I am often near the horses. That was the first time I heard her make a joke. It took me until I was 3 miles down the road to notice it had been one. Here is what I have not said, and I have been not saying it for 4 pages, which tells you something about me. Her name was Nahzhee, and I never in 11 months got it exactly right, and she never once corrected me after the first time. She was maybe 30, maybe 35. She had a scar that came down from her hairline across her left temple and stopped, and her eyes were clouded pale blue-white like the sky in August when it's thinking about rain and won't. She had been blinded by a fever that came after a beating, and the beating came from a man in a uniform, and that is the entire sum of what she ever told anybody about it. And she told it exactly once, to Toby, and he told me exactly once, and neither of us ever repeated it again until now. Her husband was dead. She'd been widowed at San Carlos in the bad year. She said his name to me one time and then said, "That is enough of him for today," and went back to work, and I have thought about that sentence for the rest of my life. That is enough of him for today. Like grief was a thing you could ration, like she'd figured out how much she could carry per day without going down. I have never learned to do that. I still can't decide which column my wife goes in. The drought started in earnest in June. I don't mean it got dry. It's always dry. I mean the Coldwater dropped so low you could walk it Drishat at the ford, and then it stopped being a creek at all and became a series of green ponds with dead things in them. And then the ponds went to mud, and the mud cracked into plates like a dropped dish. By the first week of July, 4 outfits in the valley had no stock water. Draper's tank stayed full, spring-fed, fenced, and Draper, and I want this understood because it's the kind of thing that gets simplified afterward, Draper let people water there. He did. Free. Anybody could bring stock. All he asked was that you talk to him first at the mercantile, sitting down with the ledger open. You'd go in for water, and you'd come out with a note. Nobody ever put a gun to a single soul in Coldwater. It was all done sitting down, with coffee, in a pleasant voice, by a man who remembered your children's ages. Toby didn't go. He wrote his line instead, and he found what his father had told him was there, 3 seeps and a sink, all of them dry, all of them gone 20 years. He dug 2 of them out by hand in the worst heat of the year and got mud and disappointment. And the 3rd day, Nahzhee said, "Take me." He said it was rough country. She said, "I have been in rough country," in a voice that ended the conversation. And Tobias Meacham, who could not be moved by a bank or a town or a rich man in a linen duster, went and saddled a horse. I was there for the 3rd day. That's not chance. I'd started finding reasons to be there, and I knew why, and the reason was that I'd stood in a churchyard eating pie. We rode up into the broken country north of the Meacham line, Toby and me, and the boy on a pony and Nahzhee behind Toby on the big gray, one hand light on his back, sitting that horse in rock country like she could see the trail. She couldn't. What she could do was listen to the horse. Around noon she said, "Stop." We stopped, heat coming off the rock in sheets, a cicada going like a saw blade somewhere, Ezra taking the pocket knife out and turning it and turning it. She got down. She stood there a long minute with her chin up and her mouth a little open, and I swear to you she was tasting the air. Then she walked no stick, hands out at hip height, feeling the space about 40 yards up a draw, and she stopped, and she knelt, and she put her whole hand flat on the ground. Then she moved 4 feet left and did it again. Then she said something in Apache short, and it wasn't for us. "Here," she said, "dig." Toby said, "There's nothing here, it's caprock." "Here," I said, and I'm not proud of it, "Toby, the horses need shade." She turned her face to me. Those pale eyes went right through my forehead and out the back of my hat. "Amos Kettle," she said, "do you smell that?" I said no. "The green, under the rock, not much." She turned back and touched the ground again, tender like a doctor. "There is a plant here that does not grow where there is no water. It is small. It is dying. It has been dying for many years, and it is not dead." She was quiet a second. "It knows something you do not know." Ezra was already off the pony with the shovel. They dug for 2.5 hours. Toby stripped to the waist and the boy hauled rock, and I did what I could, which was less than either of them. And at 4 feet down the caprock broke into a gravel that was cool as a cellar. And at 5 feet the shovel came up with mud on it. And at 5.5 feet the hole began, slowly and without any drama at all, to fill with water. Ezra made a sound, not a word. He was 9 and he had watched his mother stop eating, and he made a sound like something coming loose. Toby sat down in the dirt with his forearms on his knees, and his shoulders started going, and he didn't make any noise at all, and none of us looked at him. And Nahzhee stood over that hole with her head tipped, listening to water come up out of the ground in a country that had none, and she said, "It is small." "It's enough," Toby said, wrecked. "It is small," she said again, patient, "and it must be shared with the deer, and it must be dug wider before winter, and if you take too much too fast it will close." She crouched and put 2 fingers in it and smelled them. "Everything that gives can be killed by taking, even this." Then, and this is the thing, she smiled, not at us, at the water. "Hello," she said to it. "He married her in August. I have gone around and around on why, and I've come to think the town had it wrong from the first, and I had it wrong for a while too. The town said, she trapped him. The town said, he's soft in the head. The town said, over dominoes at the Mercantile, loud enough for me to hear and for Draper to not quite stop, that a man who's lost his mother and father in a year will attach himself to any woman who feeds him, and it was almost clever, that one. It was almost worth the 12 seconds it took a man to think it up. Here's what I think. I think Toby had been offered a bargain over and over in that pleasant voice, sitting down with coffee. Sell the ground, marry the daughter, water your stock, sign your name. Every one of those bargains had a hook in it, and every one was reasonable, and every one would have worked. And then he watched a woman who owned nothing in this world but a sack and a stick kneel down and say hello to some water. He didn't marry her out of gratitude. Gratitude would have been wages. He didn't marry her out of pity, because you cannot pity a person who is that much less afraid than you are. He married her because he'd finally seen someone refuse a bargain harder than he could, and he wanted to stand next to it. Whether she loved him then, I don't know, I never asked. It wasn't mine. But I'll tell you that on the morning of the wedding, I rode over early with a ham, and I came around the corner of the house, and she was standing at the wash line with her hands full of clothespins, and Toby was saying something to her too low for me to hear, and she laughed. Out loud, hid back. I turned my horse around and rode a mile and came back, and I never told either of them I'd seen it, and it is the single most valuable thing I own. Then the churchyard, then the fence post, then the pie. And then the summer went bad in the particular way that summers go bad not all at once, but like a tooth. The first week, someone cut the wire on the north pasture and 40 head walked out onto the flat, and it took Toby 3 days to gather them. Could have been anybody. Could have been a bull. The second week, Ezra came home from town with his lip split. He wouldn't say who. He turned the pocket knife over in his hands for an hour and a half, and finally he said, "TH, they said she can't see me. TH, they said she doesn't even know what I look like." And he cried, and Toby held him. And later that night I found Toby out behind the barn with his fist against the wall, just pressing it there, hard, not hitting, pressing, like he was trying to push the whole building over. The third week, the Coldwater Stock and Savings sent a writer out with a paper. The note wasn't due till spring, but there was a clause in it. There's always a clause, and no man in that valley had ever read one, that let the bank call it early if the security materially depreciated. Meaning the cattle, meaning a drought year heard on a place with no water. 90 days. $1,140. Toby stood in the yard with the paper in his hand for a long time, and then he folded it into a square, and then a smaller square, and he put it in his shirt pocket over his heart like a fool or a saint, and he went and finished shoeing a horse. I rode home, and I got out my ledger, and I sat at my kitchen table with the lamp going, and I opened to a fresh page. Owed on the left, everything I owed Eugene Meacham, which is a life. Owing on the right, everything Coldwater owed a woman who found water for a town that wouldn't say her name right. And in the middle, where there's no column, I wrote down what I'd done in the churchyard, which was nothing, and I looked at it for a while, and then I closed the book. I had $1,100 in a coffee tin, under a floorboard, 17 years of it. I told myself I'd take it over in the morning. That's the lie I tell about that night, and I've told it so long I've almost got it worn smooth. The truth is I sat there until the lamp guttered, and I did not decide anything. I thought about my wife. I thought about how a man gets to 54 with 2 columns and no third one, and how the third column is the only one that ever mattered, and how it takes a certain kind of animal courage to write in a book that has no lines in it. I was still sitting there at 11 when the wind changed. I have lived in that valley 40 years. I know what the wind carries: dust, sage after rain when there is rain, cattle, wood smoke off the town in winter. This came in on the north wind thin, and it was wrong. Coal oil. I stood up so fast the chair went over. My hands didn't work right on the door latch. And when I got out on the porch, the north sky over the Meacham place had a low orange smudge on it. Not big, not yet. The size of a thumbnail held at arm's length. And then I heard the horses. 2 miles off. 2 miles, and I heard them. And if you have never heard a horse scream in a burning barn, then I hope to God you get through your life without it. Because there is nothing else on this earth that sounds like that. And a man who hears it once will hear it in his sleep for the next 30 years. I was on my mare bareback before I knew I'd moved. And the whole ride over 2 miles, 4 minutes. The mare's neck lathered and my heart trying to come up my throat. One thing kept going through my head: over and over, in her careful voice, with the stones set down in the creek crossing. Everything that gives can be killed by taking. Ezra slept in the loft. Ezra slept in the loft over the horses, because he liked to hear them breathe. And when I came around the last rise with the whole world gone orange, when I saw Toby Meacham on his knees in the yard where the smoke had put him, retching, blind as a stone, clawing at the dirt, and trying to crawl back toward a doorway that was already a wall of fire, I saw her. She was walking, not running, walking with her hands out at hip height, feeling the space through smoke that had taken every eye in that yard. Into the barn, where the dark meant nothing to her. She walked into the barn the way a woman walks into her own kitchen at night. That's the detail nobody in Coldwater ever believed, and it's the one I'd swear to on any book you put in front of me. She did not hesitate at the door. She did not throw up an arm against the heat. She went in with her hands at hip height and her chin level and her feet finding the ground the way they always found it, and the fire went over her head in a red sheet and closed behind her like water closing over a dropped stone. Toby came up off his knees screaming her name, and I hit him from the side and took him down into the dirt. I want to be honest about that because I've heard it told the other way. Amos Kettle held him back. Amos Kettle saved him, and that's not it. I hit him because I was afraid, and a man alone in the dark with his fear will grab whatever's nearest. If he'd gone in, he'd have died in 9 feet. He couldn't see. His eyes were streaming and his throat was closed, and he'd already been in once. That's why he was on his knees. He'd already been in, and the smoke had turned him around and spat him back out. He fought me. He got a hand in my beard and pulled out a fistful of it, and I've still got a white patch there where nothing grew back, and I look at it every morning in the glass. Then he stopped fighting all at once, the way a rope stops when it breaks. And we lay there in the dirt in the orange light like 2 drunks, and we listened. Here is what a burning barn sounds like from the outside, when someone you love is inside it. It sounds like weather. That's the awful part. It sounds like a big wind in big trees, a long, steady, tearing roar with no malice in it at all, and under that the pop and crack of green wood, and under that, so faint you have to stop your own heart to hear it, the horses. There were 9 horses in that barn. Toby's gray. The 2 worked teams. A colt he'd been offered $40 for in June and hadn't sold because Ezra had named him. Ezra was in the loft. I could see the loft door. It was 30 feet from where we lay, and it might as well have been in Kansas. The whole front of the barn was going, and the fire had gotten up under the shingles and was running along the ridge, and the loft door was a black square in all that orange with smoke pouring out the top of it like a chimney turned wrong. Toby said, into the dirt. He sleeps up there because he likes to hear them breathe. I said nothing, there was nothing. And then the loft door filled up. I'll tell it the way I saw it, and if it sounds like a thing out of a Bible story, that's not my fault. I was there and it wasn't beautiful. It was ugly, and it went slow. She came to the door and she was carrying him. 9 years old is not a small boy. Ezra was skinny, but he was 30-odd yards of bone and he was dead weight, hanging over her shoulder with his arms swinging, and she had climbed a ladder in the dark with him, in a burning building, with one hand. She got to the edge and she stopped, and she turned her head. She was listening. In all that noise she was listening, and I understood with a kind of horror what she was listening for. She was trying to find the ground. She didn't know how high she was. She had never seen that loft door. She had climbed the ladder by counting rungs, and she was standing at the edge of a drop she could not measure, and there was fire coming up through the floor behind her. Toby got his legs under him. He ran to the wall below her and he shouted, not words, just noise, just the sound of himself, and he kept shouting steady, a rhythm. Here, 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 and she turned her face down toward it and she found him. She let go of the boy. Not through. Let go. Fed him out over the edge, held him by one wrist until her arm was straight, and dropped him the last 6 feet into his brother's arms, and Toby went down under him and rolled. Then the roof came in. I got her out. That's the ledger entry, and I have never once been comfortable with it. I got her out because the loft floor went and dumped her sideways through the north wall where the boards had already burned to charcoal, and she came through in a gout of sparks and landed in the manure pile, which is a stupid, undignified, filthy detail that I am putting in on purpose. It was 6 feet of old manure and it was damp underneath. It saved her. I dragged her out of it by the ankles. Her hair was on fire. I beat it out with my hat and my hands, and I have 3 fingers on my left that don't lie straight anymore, which is a small price, and I never say so out loud because people get a look on their faces. She was breathing. She was breathing badly, in a way I'd heard once before in a war from a man who did not last the night. And she was saying something. I put my ear down to her mouth, soot on her lips. Her voice was gone, there was nothing left of it, just air moving through a ruined place. She said, "The horses." 2 of them got out. The gray went through the corral rails from the inside, took them out like matchwood, and ran 4 miles and stood in a dry wash shivering till morning. The colt got out because Ezra had never once latched that stall properly and had been scolded for it 100 times. 7 died. I'm not going to describe it. I sat in the dirt with her head on my leg and my burnt hand in the air like a fool holding something, and I watched Tobias Meacham kneel over his brother and press his ear to the boy's chest, and I watched the whole shape of that man's life balance on one small sound. Ezra coughed. Toby made a noise I have never heard a grown man make, and hope never to hear again. The barn burned till dawn. The wind died about 3 and it burned straight up after that, a column, red at the bottom and black at the top, and you could see it from the town. Nobody came. I want that written down. That's the entry. From the Meacham place you can see the lights of Coldwater. From Coldwater you could see that barn burn for 6 hours. Nobody came. The doctor came out from Silver City on the 2nd day and looked at her, and said the thing doctors say when they mean no. "Smoke's the trouble," he said, out in the yard, with his back to the door so she couldn't hear him, which was pointless. She could hear a horse's step on packed dirt at 40 yards. "It burns the inside. You can't put salve on the inside." Toby said, "What do we do?" "Keep her upright, keep her drinking, pray if you're the sort." He was tired and not unkind. "I've seen 'em come back from worse. I've seen 'em go from less." She lived 11 days. I'm going to say that now so you're not sitting there hopping. She lived 11 days and I was there for 9 of them because I'd stopped going home, and because my own place could burn down for all I cared by then, and it very nearly did, but that's another page. Those 11 days are the reason I burned this story twice. Ezra didn't speak for 4 of them. He sat by the bed. He wouldn't be moved. He had a scorch across his back where a beam had come down alongside him, and the doctor dressed it and the boy never made a sound, and afterward he went right back to that chair. He took out his father's pocket knife and he turned it over, and over, and over. On the 4th day, her hand came out from under the blanket and found his wrist. She said, and every word cost her, you could see the price on her face, "Open it." He looked at her. He shook his head, which she couldn't see, and then he remembered and he said, "No, it's Pa's." "Open it. It's Peepaw's." And she said, "Then it is a knife that has been closed for 2 years. She had to stop. She breathed. It sounded like a saw in wet wood. A thing that only remembers is not a thing. It is a stone. Another stop. Open it." He opened it. His hands were shaking so bad he cut his thumb on the short blade, the broken one, and he sat there bleeding and holding it open and looking at it like it had turned into a snake. She said, "Good, now cut something." He cut a piece of string off the chair. Then he cut another one. Then he went out and whittled a peg for a stall that had no stall to hold any more, and he came back in with his eyes red and his hands busy. And I have thought about that woman spending some of her 11 days on this, on this exact small thing when she had so few, and I don't have anything to say about it that isn't just noise. On the 6th day Delia Draper came. She came alone, at dusk, on a good horse, in a riding habit that cost more than my saddle, and she got down at the gate and stood there with the reins in her hand like she couldn't decide. Toby came out on the porch, and the two of them looked at each other across 40 feet of yard and 8 months. I was at the corral pretending to fix a hinge. She said, "Is she alive?" He said, "Yes." She said, I brought and stopped and looked down at what she was holding, and it was a jar of honey and a folded sheet, and I watched her understand in real time exactly how absurd that was, and I watched her decide to hold onto it anyway. Toby didn't ask her in. He didn't send her off either. He stood there. And Delia Draper said the sentence that I have carried around ever since like a stone in my boot. He didn't order it, she said. Toby, I need you to hear that from me. He didn't order it and he didn't do it, and he's been shut in the back room for 2 days and hasn't eaten. Toby said, then who? Men who wanted him to be pleased with them. The wind went through the yard. A shingle lifted somewhere on the house and settled. That's worse, Toby said, quietly, not to her. Delia, do you understand that's worse? She stood there another minute. Then she put the honey and the sheet on the gatepost and got on her horse and rode away, and I never in this life saw her again, and I have never once been able to decide what column that woman goes in. That's the thing about Draper's kind of power. He never lit a match. He didn't have to. He'd spent 9 years teaching a town what pleased him, and one night the town went out and did it, and every man who struck the flint could go home believing he was doing a favor for a friend. The banknote was still in Toby's shirt pocket. $1,140, 90 days, and now the herd had no barn and no winter hay and 7 dead horses. Draper hadn't needed to do a thing. He never did. On the 9th day she asked for me by name. Both parts the way she did. Amos Kettle. Toby brought me in and then went out because she asked him to, and he went, and he stood in the yard where I could see him through the window with his hands hanging. The room was hot. They'd been keeping the window shut against the dust. There was a smell in there, coal oil still in her hair, after 9 days and God knows how many washings, and I think of that smell now when I hear a preacher talk about hell, and I think preachers don't know anything about it. She said, you still write? Yes. In the little book. Yes, ma'am. Show me. I said stupidly, you can't, and stopped and wanted to walk into the sea. She smiled, not much, 1/4 of an inch. I know what a book feels like. So I took it out and put it in her hands, and she held it, turned it over, ran her thumb along the string binding, and her hands were burned, they were wrapped, and she did all this with 2 fingers and a thumb that still worked. 2 lines, she said, on every page. I feel that her thumb went down the crease where I'd ruled the margin year after year, hard enough to score the paper, the road down the middle. Owed, I said, and owing. Which one am I in? I didn't answer. She waited. She was better at waiting than any human being I have ever met, and I sat in that hot room and listened to her breathe and did not answer, and the silence went on so long that a fly landed on the sill and cleaned itself and left. Amos Kettle, she said at last, in the churchyard you did not laugh. No, ma'am. And you did not speak. No, ma'am. Then you were in neither line. She turned the book over again. You were the road. I put my face in my hands, 54 years old. She let me be for a while. Then she said, and her voice was going, it was almost gone, and I had to lean in until my ear was near her mouth. The water will close. I said, what? The seep, a long breath. It is small. He will take too much. He will be afraid, and he will take too much, and it will close, and he will think it was the drought. Her hand came up and closed on my sleeve, and there was strength in it that had no business being there. Dig it wider, not deeper, wider, and do not let him fence it. He'll fence it, Amos, everybody fences. Do not let him fence it. Her grip was hurting me. Draper fenced water and it made him a small man in a big coat. Tobias is not small, but he is afraid, and fear is a fence a man builds inside himself first. She let go. She was spent. She lay there a long time and I thought she'd gone to sleep, and I was starting to stand up when she said, "The deer will come, and the town." I said, "The town?" "Yes." "Nahzhee, they stood in a churchyard and laughed at you. Nobody came when the barn, nobody came. They watched it burn from their porches, they." "Yes," she said. And then she said the thing. Water does not ask what a man deserves. I have run that sentence through my hands 10,000 times, the way Ezra ran that knife, and I have never gotten to the bottom of it. I want it to be forgiveness. It isn't. She never forgave them, and she never said she did, and I don't believe she ought to have. And anybody who tells that story like she did is telling it to make themselves comfortable. I think what she meant was harder than forgiveness and colder, and about 100 times more useful. I think she meant, the water doesn't care. The water is not a moral instrument. If you turn it into one, if you make it a fence, a favor, a debt, a lesson, you have become Draper, and it will not matter one bit that you were right. I think she meant that Toby was 90 days from losing everything, and about 11 minutes from becoming the exact man who'd taken it. She died on the 11th day, in the afternoon, in the heat, with the window open at last because Ezra had gotten stubborn about it. Toby was holding her hand. He'd been holding it for 6 hours. She didn't say anything at the end. People always want her to have said something at the end. She just went further and further out, the way the tide goes out in the same room in the same light, with a fly on the sill and a boy in a chair. And at some point Toby stopped saying here, here, here because there was no more use in it. He held on another hour anyway. We buried her on the rise above the seep. 6 people, Toby, Ezra, me, Reverend Sill who came, and I will give him that until the day I die he came, and he was gray in the face the whole time, and 2 of my hands because I made them. Sill said a few words. Toby didn't say any. Ezra stood with his father's knife open in his hand the whole time and cut a little notch in the handle at the end, and I don't know if anybody else saw it. And when it was done, and the others had walked down, Toby stood there and I stood next to him because I couldn't think how to leave. He said, "Amos, I've got 7 dead horses and no barn and no hay and 81 days. I said, "I know." He said I could take it to law, the wire, the barn, somebody in that town knows who did it. You could. Or I could go down there and he stopped. He put his hand over his mouth. He was 27. I keep seeing it, he said behind his hand. I keep seeing myself doing it. It's the only thing that helps. I lie in that bed and I plan it, and it's the only thing that lets me sleep. That's the morally heavy part, not the fire. Anybody can burn a barn. I stood on that rise with the fresh dirt at my feet, and I thought about a woman who had been beaten blind and abandoned on a road and set aside like a broken hamestrap, and who had walked east at a pace, and who had gotten down off a horse in Caprock country and knelt and said hello to the water. I said, "She told me not to let you fence the seep." He turned and looked at me like I'd struck him. "She what?" "She said you'd be afraid and you'd take too much and it'd close, and she said the deer would come, and the town." "The town." That's what I said. Toby Meacham stood there on the rise and he cried, standing up with his arms at his sides, in the particular way of a man who has run out of every other thing. And then he went down the hill and he did not fence it. Here's the part the story wants me to give you. It wants me to tell you the town came and drank and was ashamed, and Draper died broke, and Toby kept his ground, and the seep ran forever, and the boy grew up straight. Some of that's true. I'll give it to you in the order it happened, and you can do what you like with it. The town came, not all at once, A town has too much pride to change its mind in public. It came in ones. Old Hetty Voss first in September, who had 6 goats and a stubbornness that made mine look like a bad mood, and who drove them 9 miles because she would not sit down with coffee and a ledger. She came at dawn so nobody would see her. Toby was up. He'd stopped sleeping. He met her at the wash and he didn't say a word and she didn't either, and she watered her goats and left. Then the Ochoas. Then the Bell brothers, who I know for a fact were in town the night of the fire, and I have my ideas about where. Then a man I won't name, who came alone at night, and who stood at that seat for a long time with his hat in his hands before he brought his cattle up. I don't know what he was doing. I have a guess. I'd sooner not write it down. By November, there was a trail up that draw worn 6 inches into the caprock. And Toby dug it wider. Not deeper, wider, the way she said, and he stone-lined it and shaded it, and he made a rule that nobody wrote down and everybody kept, which is the only kind of rule that holds. You water, you dig. Every man that drank there moved rock. The Bell brothers moved a lot of rock. I noticed that, and I have never said anything to them about it, and I never will. The deer came too, every evening. You could sit up on the rise by the grave and watch them come down out of the rocks at dusk, careful, ears going, and stand in a country that had killed 1,000 things that year, and drink. She was right about all of it. Draper. I'd like to tell you he died broke, and I can't. He died at 71, in a bed, in 1902, of an enlarged heart, well liked. There's a stained glass window in the Coldwater church with his name at the bottom of it, and the light comes through it green and gold in the afternoons and falls across the pews where the town sits on Sundays. He never got the Meacham place. Not because we beat him. Because the freight contract went to the railhead at Deming in '88 and the mercantile went thin, and the man simply stopped needing 460 acres of hard grass. The way a flood stops needing a house once it's found a lower way around. That's the truth about that kind of power. It doesn't lose, it just goes elsewhere. And the note, $1,140, 81 days, was paid in full on the 3rd of October, 1887, in gold and silver coin, out of a coffee tin, by a 54-year-old man who carried it into that bank in a flour sack, and set it on the counter and would not sit down. The clerk asked me to sit down. I said I'd stand. I have never told Toby where the money came from. He knows. Of course he knows. There are only so many fools in a valley. But we have never once said it out loud in 32 years, and we are not going to start now. And if he brings it up at my funeral, I will come up out of the box. Here is what I did that night, and this is why I burned this thing twice. And this is the last honest thing I have to say. I went home and I got out my ledger. I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp, and I opened to the page with my wife's name on it, the one with just a date and nothing else, and I looked at the 2 columns and the hard-scored road down the middle. And I took a knife and I cut that page out. Then I cut out the next one, and the next. Every ruled page in that book, 17 years of owed and owing, of who took a calf in '79 and who never returned a post-hole digger, and I fed them into the stove one at a time and watched the columns go up, and it took most of the night, and I did not feel one bit better, and I have never regretted it. Then I ruled a new page with no line down the middle. I couldn't think what to put at the top of it. I sat there till the light came gray in the window. Finally I wrote her name. And I spelled it the way Toby said it, 3 sounds where the town heard 2, and the middle one soft, and I have no idea if I got it right, and there is nobody left alive who can tell me. Ezra Meacham is 41 years old. He's got a place of his own on the Mimbers and 4 children, and he still doesn't talk much, and the stutter went somewhere around 15 and comes back when he's tired. He runs horses, good ones. Everybody says he's got away with them and nobody can say what it is, and when they ask him he shrugs, and I've watched him shrug and I know exactly what he's not saying. He carries a bone-handled pocket knife with a broken blade and 11 notches in the handle. I asked him one time, at a branding, both of us tired and neither of us watching our mouths. I asked him what the notches were. He said days. I said 11. And he opened the knife and closed it and looked out at the country and said, she had 11. I didn't want them to be nothing. I am 72 years old and my hands don't work, and I am writing this in November with the wind coming down off the mesa, and the third page of a book with no lines in it. The seep still runs. It ran through '93 when everything else in the valley went to dust and the whole country ate itself. And there is a generation in Coldwater now that thinks it was always there, that it's just water, that it came up out of the ground the way water does. Nobody remembers her name. Not one soul in that town. There's a stained glass window for a man who never lit a match, and there is not so much as a board with her name on it anywhere in the county. And the grave on the rise has gone to grass. And last spring I could not find it. And I walked that hill for 2 hours in the rain like an old fool with a wet hat, and I could not find it. Toby's up there now, 11 years now, beside her, I hope. I helped dig it and I still couldn't tell you within 30 feet. There's a thing I've never written, and I'm going to write it and then I'm going to stop, because my hand is going. The morning of the wedding, when I came around the corner of the house with that ham, and she was at the wash line, and he said something low, and she laughed with her head back. I have spent 32 years wondering what he said. And I have never once, in all that time, wished I'd been close enough to hear it. That's not mine. I've made my peace with the 2 columns and the road between them, and the fact that a man can stand in a churchyard and say nothing and spend the rest of his life trying to pay for it, and mostly fail and go on trying. But I'd give the rest of what I've got to hear that laugh again. Just that. Just the sound of it, coming across a yard in a dry year from a woman who could not see the sun she was standing in and turned her face up to it anyway. The wind's up. The deer'll be coming down to the water about now. I ought to go and